More than 300,000 people have been forced out of their homes across France and Spain in the last week of July 2026, according to figures confirmed by officials on the ground. And that number is still climbing as new evacuation orders go out almost every single day. This is not a small regional brushfire story anymore. This is one of the largest civilian displacement events tied to wildfire in modern European history, and it is unfolding right now in real time across 3 countries at once. Spain, France, and Italy are all burning simultaneously, and the scale of what is happening has genuinely stunned emergency services that have spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of summer. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they tell a story that no amount of dramatic language could improve on. In Spain alone, more than 100,000 people have been evacuated, with close to 30,000 of those coming from the Madrid region specifically. In France, the Department of Gironde, home to Bordeaux and some of the most famous wine country on the planet, has seen roughly 220,000 people evacuated from their homes and sent towards shelters in the city itself. Add those 2 figures together, and you already have something in the neighborhood of the entire population of a mid-sized European city uprooted overnight, sleeping in exhibition centers, school gyms, and emergency shelters, waiting to find out if their homes are still standing. Meanwhile, in Italy, the picture is different, but no less alarming. Sicily has logged more than 1,400 separate firefighting interventions since the middle of July. Calabria has reported more than 160 individual fire outbreaks in a single 24-hour period at the peak of the crisis, and blazes have also broken out as far north as Piedmont in the Alps, a region that has traditionally been considered far too cool and wet for this kind of fire behavior. When wildfires start climbing into alpine terrain, that is usually a signal that something structural has shifted in how these fires behave, not just a one-off bad week of weather. So how did we get here? The short answer is heat, drought, and wind, stacked on top of each other at the worst possible moment in the calendar. Europe came into this summer following an unusually wet winter, which sounds like it should have been protective, but instead it did the opposite. All that winter rain produced a surge of vegetation growth across Spain, France, and Italy. Then, an intense and prolonged heat wave arrived in June and July, and that same vegetation that had grown so thick over the winter dried out completely, turning huge stretches of countryside into what fire scientists literally describe as a tinderbox. In France's Gironde region specifically, meteorologists have pointed to this exact mechanism, the wet growth followed by extreme heat drying it into fuel, as the direct cause of how quickly these fires spread once they ignited. Layered on top of that is a heat wave that pushed temperatures past 40 degrees Celsius in multiple locations. In Sicily, temperatures approached 45 degrees Celsius at points during the crisis. In Domodossola, in northern Italy, thermometers hit 39 degrees. And even at elevation, in a town called Alla di Stura, sitting at 1,000 meters above sea level, temperatures reached 33.5 degrees, numbers that would be unremarkable at sea level in August, but are genuinely extreme for a mountain town at that altitude. These are not typical summer numbers. These are the kinds of readings that fire behavior analysts flag as conditions where a single spark, whether from lightning, a discarded cigarette, agricultural equipment, or deliberate arson, can become an uncontrollable front within hours. Let's talk about Spain in detail, because the Spanish fires have become the most severe individual event of this entire crisis. The largest fire is burning in the province of Ávila, west of Madrid, and it has become the biggest wildfire in Spain's recorded history, having already scorched more than 500 square kilometers, which works out to roughly 193 square miles of scorched terrain. To put that into perspective, that is larger than some entire cities. That is a landscape the size of a small country region, burned in the space of about a week. Just as concerning is what has been happening on the edges of that fire. Spanish authorities have been racing to prevent 2 separate blazes west of Madrid from merging into a single megafire. At one point, the 2 fires were touching along a stretch of roughly 14 to 15 kilometers near a town called San Martín de Valdeiglesias, sitting between Madrid and Ávila. The head of Spain's military emergency unit has personally overseen efforts to keep these 2 fronts from combining, because a merged fire of that scale becomes exponentially harder to control, both because of the raw size and because merging fire fronts can generate their own extreme fire behavior, including fire-generated winds and unpredictable jumps that put firefighters at serious risk. To fight these fires, Spain has deployed more than 2,700 personnel, over 400 ground vehicles, and 21 aircraft. And this is not a purely domestic effort anymore. Firefighting crews from Greece, Italy, and Portugal have all sent reinforcements to help battle the Spanish blazes, which tells you something important. This crisis has gotten large enough that Spain's own considerable firefighting infrastructure needed outside help, and neighboring countries that are themselves dealing with their own fire seasons are still sending resources across the border, because everyone understands that a fire this size anywhere in the region is a threat to the whole continent's summer. One town in particular captures the human cost of what's happening in Spain better than any statistic can. Navas del Rey is a town of around 3,400 people in the community of Madrid. The wildfire swept through the surrounding mountainous terrain starting on a Thursday, and by Friday the fire had moved through the town itself, forcing authorities to evacuate every single resident until further notice. Journalists who visited afterward described the entrance to the town lined with charred shrubs. The ground turned black in multiple stretches, a thick column of smoke still visible rising from the mountains beyond. An entire town emptied out, standing there scorched and silent, is the image that best sums up what tens of thousands of families across central Spain are now living through. There's a small piece of good news buried in the Spanish numbers, and it deserves mention because it shows that containment efforts are starting to have some effect. Of the roughly 63,000 people evacuated across the central Spanish regions of Madrid, Toledo, and Ávila, about 24,000 have already been allowed to return to their homes, according to Spain's government delegate for the Madrid region. That is real progress, even as the largest individual fire in the country's history continues to burn nearby. It is a reminder that these crises do not move in a single direction. Some areas stabilize even while others deteriorate, and the overall picture stays fluid and dangerous. Now let's turn to France, where the situation centers heavily on the Gironde department in the southwest, the very region that produces much of the world's Bordeaux wine. French authorities issued new evacuation orders overnight, sending phone alerts directly to residents in at least 5 towns, instructing them to move toward Bordeaux immediately. Thousands of people are now sheltering in the city, many of them at the Bordeaux Exhibition Center, which has been converted into an emergency shelter, complete with volunteers, sorting donated clothing and food for displaced families. Watching footage of that scene, cots lined up in a convention hall usually reserved for trade shows, tells you everything about how quickly ordinary infrastructure gets repurposed when a disaster of this scale hits. The fire near Lacanau in the Gironde region has burned amid what officials describe as worsening drought conditions following the heat wave and ongoing water shortages across much of France. Smoke has been visible, rising from areas north of the Arcachon Basin in the southwest of the country, an area popular with tourists for its beaches and its famous sand dune, now dealing with an entirely different kind of visitor, fire crews working around the clock. The human cost among first responders in France has been severe. 93 firefighters have been injured while battling the Gironde blaze alone, according to the regional prefecture, a staggering number that reflects both the intensity of the fire behavior and the sheer duration crews have had to remain in the field. Infrastructure has taken a hit too. The A63 highway, a major route running south from Bordeaux, has remained partially closed because of the fires, and rail traffic south of the city has been suspended entirely, except for the specific route running toward Toulouse. When a wildfire starts closing interstate highways and suspending national rail lines, it stops being a rural land management problem and becomes a full-blown national infrastructure crisis. There is also a fascinating and slightly less dire subplot running through the French coverage centered on the region's wine industry. Because Bordeaux is one of the most famous wine-producing areas on the planet, concerned wine lovers from around the world have reportedly been calling wine experts and tour guides in the region, worried about the fate of the 2026 vintage. One Bordeaux-based wine expert has said that despite the alarming footage circulating online, the vineyards themselves have not actually been damaged by the fires so far. And more importantly, the grapes are still hard and small at this stage of the growing season, essentially unripe, which means they are not yet capable of absorbing smoke taint the way fully ripened fruit would. A food chemistry expert at a university in California weighed in as well, explaining that as grapes ripen later in the season, sugars within the fruit can bind with phenolic compounds present in wildfire smoke, producing what winemakers call smoke taint, a flavor defect that has been described as ashy and unpleasant. The risk, according to that same expert, depends heavily on wind direction, meaning if smoke continues blowing toward the vineyards later in the season, once the grapes have ripened further, the risk to this year's harvest could increase. For now, though, the industry appears to have dodged the worst of it, a small silver lining in an otherwise grim news cycle. Now to Italy, where the wildfire crisis has taken on a noticeably different character, driven heavily by extreme heat in the south, combined with a disturbing pattern of deliberate arson. Sicily has been at the center of the Italian crisis. Italy's National Fire and Rescue Service reported carrying out more than 1,400 individual firefighting interventions across the island in roughly a 5-day span in the middle of July. At one point, the regional government reported that of 344 individual fires recorded on the island, 300 had already been extinguished, which shows both the scale of ignition events happening simultaneously and the genuinely impressive throughput of the firefighting response trying to keep pace with them. Around 6,000 emergency responders have been mobilized in Sicily alone, combining firefighters, forest guards, and civil protection officers, supported by water-bombing aircraft working the most critical fronts. Officials named several of the worst affected locations, including areas around Casaboli, Bavona, Alamena, San Cataldo, sections of the Madoni Regional Park, and the area around Syracuse. In the town of Agrigento, roughly 100 people were evacuated, including 22 patients who had to be moved out of a medical clinic, a detail that underscores how these evacuations are not simply about empty houses. They involve moving vulnerable people, including hospital patients, out of harm's way under extreme time pressure. The human toll among Italian firefighters has been tragic. A 59-year-old fire service corporal died from a medical emergency while conducting firefighting operations near Caltanissetta in Sicily. Italy's interior minister also confirmed the death of a firefighter named in official statements who died while responding to a fire near San Cataldo. Sicily's regional government has since approved an initial relief package worth 25 million euros, intended to cover civil protection response costs and support for those who have suffered damage. Then there is Calabria, in the far south of the Italian mainland, where more than 160 separate fires were recorded in a single 24-hour period at the height of the crisis. What makes the Calabria situation especially disturbing is that local civil protection officials have directly blamed a significant share of these fires on deliberate arson. According to reporting on the ground, alleged arsonists in the region have used shockingly cruel methods to spread flames quickly, including tying rags soaked in flammable liquid to the tails of stray cats and releasing them to spread fire across wide areas as the animals ran in panic. This is being actively investigated as a pattern of organized, malicious fire setting, not an accident of nature. And it echoes a broader and troubling history in Italy where past major fire seasons, including a deadly one in 2021, were also substantially driven by organized arson rather than purely natural ignition sources like lightning or drought alone. Beyond Sicily and Calabria, fires have also broken out simultaneously in Sardinia and in the Piedmont region in Italy's north near the Alps. In Piedmont, fire officials have pointed to lightning strikes during severe thunderstorms as the ignition source, with the fires then spreading rapidly because of persistently high temperatures, parched soil, and strong downslope winds coming off the mountains. The presence of significant fire activity in an alpine region is notable specifically because it represents an expansion of the geographic footprint of Italy's fire season into terrain that has historically been far less prone to this kind of large-scale burning. There has also been at least one genuinely dramatic rescue operation tied to the Italian fires. The Italian Coast Guard confirmed that it rescued more than 400 tourists and swimmers from a beach area in Apulia, on Italy's southeastern coast, after a fire at a seaside location called Cala Manacor, within the municipality of Petrici, left people with no way to escape except by sea. Officials described the fire as cutting off every land-based escape route, meaning that boats had to be brought in to pull the stranded tourists and swimmers off the beach directly, an image that captures just how suddenly these fires can trap people who had no idea moments earlier that they were in any danger at all. Adding all of this together, across the whole country, Italy has already seen more than 65,000 hectares burned so far in 2026, a figure that sits roughly 15% above the 20-year national average. And that number was compiled while multiple named wildfires were still actively burning, meaning the final total for the year is almost certain to climb well beyond it. Earlier in the season, before the worst of the July crisis even began, satellite monitoring already showed more than 11,000 hectares burned nationally, with more than 5,000 of those hectares accounted for in June and July alone, which shows how sharply the pace of destruction accelerated once the heat wave truly took hold. Across all three countries, the confirmed death toll among firefighters and emergency responders currently stands at multiple individuals, with reporting from a single especially brutal week in late July describing 3 firefighters killed on a single day across the region, 2 in France and 1 in Sicily. That Sicilian firefighter has been identified in official statements from Italy's Interior Ministry. These are not abstract statistics. These are people who went toward the fire while everyone else was fleeing from it, and it cost them their lives. It is worth stepping back for a moment to talk about why this is happening now, and why officials and climate scientists are drawing a direct line between this crisis and the broader pattern of a warming climate. Data from Copernicus, the European Union's climate change monitoring service, shows that France has already experienced 3.4 times as many individual fires this year as its annual average, and Spain has recorded 1.7 times as many fires as its typical yearly average. And this is happening with a significant portion of the traditional fire season, which usually runs through September and even into October, still ahead. A researcher at Spain's Center for Research on Desertification in Valencia put it directly, saying that these fires represent exactly what scientists have expected and warned about for decades, arguing that if global temperatures continue rising, the frequency, size, and intensity of wildfires will keep increasing as a direct consequence. Italy's own environmental research agency has separately noted that the Mediterranean region is warming at roughly twice the global average rate, a detail that matters enormously here because it means the countries bordering the Mediterranean, Exactly, the countries at the center of this crisis are experiencing the effects of climate change on an accelerated timeline compared to much of the rest of the world. That accelerated warming translates directly into longer, hotter, drier summers, which in turn means longer and more intense fire seasons, more vegetation stress, and more days each year that fall into the extreme fire danger category that meteorologists use to warn the public. Even members of the British royal family have weighed in publicly on what is happening. Prince William described the wildfires hitting Spain, France, and also parts of the United Kingdom as a stark reminder of the challenges posed by what he called an increasingly extreme climate, a comment that reflects how far this story has traveled beyond a regional news item and into the realm of a continent-wide moment that political and public figures feel compelled to address directly. Satellite imagery has played a significant role in documenting the scale of destruction here as well. Commercial satellite providers have released before and after imagery of areas like Le Porge in France's Gironde department, showing the transformation of the landscape from earlier in the year to the height of the current crisis, with visible burn scars stretching across what had been dense forest and vegetation just months earlier. These images have circulated widely and have done as much as any written report to convey the true physical scale of what is burning, because ground-level photography, as dramatic as it is, cannot always capture just how far these fires have spread across the wider landscape the way an overhead satellite view can. Let's talk about infrastructure disruption more broadly, because that is one of the underappreciated dimensions of a crisis like this. In Sicily, the wildfire emergency has directly affected air travel, with disruptions reported at multiple airports across the island as fires approached the vicinity of runways and access roads. Authorities have specifically urged travelers to check directly with airports and airlines on the day of travel rather than relying on earlier updates, because the situation has been changing literally day by day, sometimes hour by hour, as new fire fronts open up or existing ones are brought under control. In France, as already mentioned, a major national highway has been partially closed, and rail service south of Bordeaux has been suspended on all but a single route. Disruptions that ripple out into the broader economy of the region, affecting everything from freight movement to the ability of tourists to reach or leave affected areas. The economic cost of a disaster on this scale, once it is fully tallied, is likely to run into the billions of euros based on comparisons with past major European fire seasons. Italy's 2021 fire season, for context, which was itself driven substantially by organized arson and burned around 50,000 hectares concentrated mainly in Calabria, Sardinia, and Sicily, produced damage estimated at roughly 5.6 billion euros and killed 6 people. Given that Italy alone has already burned more than 65,000 hectares this year, well above that 2021 total, and that Spain and France are each dealing with historic individual fires layered on top of their own broader national fire activity, the eventual economic toll of the 2026 season, once agricultural losses, tourism disruption, infrastructure damage, and firefighting costs are all added together, could realistically exceed what was seen in that previous benchmark disaster. There's also the question of what happens after the flames themselves are put out, because wildfire recovery is its own long, difficult process. Communities like Navas del Rey in Spain will need to assess structural damage to homes and buildings, restore power and water infrastructure, and manage the ecological aftermath of losing that much vegetation across steep mountainous terrain, which in many cases increases the risk of dangerous flash flooding and landslides during the very next rainfall event, because burned hillsides no longer have the root systems and ground cover needed to hold soil in place. This is a pattern that has played out repeatedly after major fire seasons in fire-prone regions around the world, where the fire itself is only the first phase of the disaster, followed by a secondary and sometimes equally dangerous phase involving erosion and flooding once normal rain eventually returns. For families directly affected, the day-to-day experience of this crisis looks like exactly what has been described from the emergency shelters in Bordeaux and near Madrid. People sleeping on cots in exhibition halls normally used for trade fairs and conventions. Volunteers, many of them from the Red Cross, sorting through donated clothing and packaged food to distribute to displaced families who left their homes with little more than what they could carry. Uncertainty about whether the house they left behind is still standing, whether pets left behind survived, whether the fire will reach their neighborhood next, or whether, like the roughly 24,000 people in the Madrid region who have already been cleared to go home, they will get the call telling them it is finally safe to return. It's also worth acknowledging the firefighters and emergency responders directly, because this entire response effort runs on their labor and, in some tragic cases, on their lives. Crews from Spain, France, and Italy have been working extended shifts in extreme heat, often exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, wearing heavy protective gear, operating in terrain made unstable by the fire itself, and facing genuinely unpredictable fire behavior, including the risk of 2 separate fire fronts merging into a single, larger, and more dangerous blaze, which is exactly the scenario Spanish commanders have been working around the clock to prevent west of Madrid. On top of the physical demands, they are working in a period where reinforcements have had to be pulled in from neighboring countries, meaning crews from Greece, Portugal, and Italy have been sent into Spain specifically to help manage a crisis too large for Spain's own considerable resources to handle alone. A genuine demonstration of cross-border cooperation happening in real time as this disaster unfolds. Looking ahead, meteorologists and fire officials have both warned that additional heat waves are expected in the near term, meaning the current fire risk is unlikely to ease significantly in the coming days. Fire crews across the region are described as racing against the next wave of extreme heat, trying to bring existing fires under control before conditions deteriorate again and either reignite contained areas or spark entirely new fronts elsewhere. Regional risk forecasting systems used across the European Union have flagged very extreme fire danger conditions, extending across a large area of Western and Central Europe, covering not just the 3 countries at the heart of this story, but stretching into the broader Alpine arc and northern Italy as well, suggesting the geographic scope of this crisis could continue to widen rather than contract in the short term. What this moment represents, when you step back from the individual fire lines and evacuation orders, is a preview of a pattern that climate researchers have been warning about for years, now playing out simultaneously across 3 of Europe's largest countries in a single summer. The specific numbers: 300,000 plus people displaced, a Spanish wildfire larger than any recorded before it, 65,000 hectares burned in Italy and rising, 93 injured firefighters in a single French region, 3 confirmed firefighter deaths across the continent in one especially brutal week, are staggering on their own. But taken together, they describe something larger than any single fire season. They describe a continent where the infrastructure, the emergency response systems, and even the underlying assumptions about which regions are vulnerable to fire, built up over decades of a more predictable climate, are now being tested simultaneously and in ways that are forcing genuine fundamental reassessment. There's also a broader tourism dimension to this story that deserves attention because late July sits right at the peak of the European summer travel season, meaning millions of visitors from around the world are currently navigating this crisis alongside the residents living through it permanently. Sicily in particular draws enormous numbers of travelers every summer, and the wildfire emergency there has directly collided with that tourist calendar. Beach destinations, historic hill towns, and popular driving routes across the island have all been affected at different points, with some areas seeing precautionary evacuations of hotels, clinics, and residential streets, even when the fire itself had not yet reached the built-up area. Travel advisories issued by regional authorities have specifically warned visitors not to treat any single update as a permanent picture of safety, since the situation on the ground has continued shifting day to day, with some roads reopening only to close again hours later as wind shifts pushed a fire front in a new direction. That uncertainty has made trip planning genuinely difficult for anyone with travel booked to the region this summer, and it has added an extra layer of strain onto a tourism economy that many of these coastal and island communities depend on heavily for their annual income. The France 24 and Euronews reporting from the most intense week of the crisis also captured just how quickly this went from a regional concern to a continent-spanning emergency covered by every major international outlet. On a single Wednesday in late July, wildfires were simultaneously described as raging in Sicily, in southwestern France, and in central Spain, with regional leaders in Sicily specifically calling the situation serious and attributing it to the combination of very high temperatures and extremely dry soil, a description that echoes almost exactly what officials in France and Spain were saying about their own fires at the very same moment. That kind of near-identical language coming independently from emergency officials in 3 different countries, speaking 3 different languages, is itself a striking piece of evidence for just how uniform the underlying weather conditions driving this crisis have been across the entire southern half of the continent. It's also worth putting some historical context around how unusual this particular convergence is. Southern Europe experiences wildfires most summers, and headlines about fires in Spain, France, or Italy individually are not new. What sets the summer of 2026 apart is the combination of 3 factors happening at once: the historic scale of the individual Spanish fire in Ávila, now the largest ever recorded in that country, the sheer number of simultaneous fire fronts across Italy stretching from Sicily in the deep south all the way to alpine terrain in Piedmont in the north, and the scale of civilian displacement in France, where the evacuation numbers out of a single department, Gironde, already rival what entire countries have experienced in past severe fire seasons. Individually, any one of these 3 national situations would already be a significant news story in a normal year. Having all 3 occur simultaneously, feeding off the same underlying heat wave and drought pattern moving across the region, is what has pushed this into the realm of a genuinely historic event for the continent as a whole. There is one more detail worth sitting with, because it captures the strange duality running through this entire crisis. at the exact same time that Spanish military emergency units were racing to keep two wildfires from merging into an uncontrollable megablaze west of Madrid. And while 93 firefighters were being treated for injuries in Gironde, and while a 59-year-old fire service corporal was dying from a medical emergency during operations near Caltanissetta, life in some corners of the affected region continued in surprisingly ordinary fashion. Wine tour guides were still fielding calls from clients asking about grape ripeness. Coast Guard crews in Apulia were pulling sunbathers off a beach by boat rather than by land. Airports reopened for a handful of flights, even as neighboring terminals stayed closed. That contrast, catastrophe and normal daily life colliding in the same week, in the same region, is part of what makes this story so difficult to summarize in a single sentence, and part of why it continues generating fresh headlines nearly every single day, rather than fading after one dramatic news cycle. For the people directly living through it in Navas del Rey, in the Gironde region around Bordeaux, in the hills near Caltanissetta and the villages of Calabria, this is not an abstract climate statistic. It is the smoke rising over their town, the phone alert telling them to leave immediately, the uncertainty of a shelter cot in a building they have never set foot in before, and the wait to find out whether home will still be there when this is finally over. As firefighting crews from 4 different countries continue working around the clock, as satellite images continue documenting the changing shape of the landscape day by day, and as the next heat wave already begins forming on forecast maps, the story of Europe's summer of fire in 2026 is still being written, and unfortunately, based on everything officials and scientists are saying right now, it is very likely far from over.